Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video, I'll be discussing my thoughts on episode 5 of the anime series Grimgar of Fantasy and Ash. And this was largely what I would refer to as being a tentpole episode. What I mean by that is it had some problems where there was, a certain amount of droll, sort of boring scenes, boring dialogue, really nothing was happening. And I've talked about this before where I reference, there's no momentum, there's no action. And I don't literally mean when I'm saying there's no action that there's no action set pieces, there's no fighting, there's no that kind of thing, I don't always necessarily mean that. And why I refer to it as a tentpole episode is because there were two very strong characterization, emotional moments that really stood out to me in this episode. Of course, following on from the death of Minato, you have these characters in a state of shock. They don't know how to progress, and the MC is very much, the world is on his shoulders right now, because Minato was looking to him to take up where he kind of sort of left off, to fill the void of the leadership role. That to me is interesting, but I felt there was just no momentum. A lot of the pacing, it was very passive, with the exception of Ranta, getting fed up with everything and sort of the argumentative nature there, and he just kind of leaves everybody and he goes to the pub that Minato used to frequent, and eventually, MC and the big burly guy show up, and what was the first tentpole for me in drawing me in was when they're just at their wits' end, their mutual wits' end, and the big guy, as Ranta and MC are fighting, finally just loses it. And he stands up, he jumps up, and he screams at them to stop. I thoroughly felt drawn into that moment. There was so much depth to that moment. Just in his doing something, just in his reaction, the way it was portrayed. Whereas so much of what surrounded it, until that argumentative, going back and forth between Ranta and MC really started carrying a momentum, a lot of the discussion was just boring and slow and passive. And as somebody who has suffered multiple deaths in my life and has had to be in that state of mourning and that state of shock, it's never anything you can get over right away. And I understood that. But there's something about the pacing of this series. It's almost an inhuman pacing. It's like I should be drawn in and feeling for these characters. But I had somebody comment on my previous episode discussion video saying this show is great. And I said, well, why is it great? Because I'm watching this particular series, at least in my estimation, we know nothing about most of these characters. There's no personality to them with the exception of Ranta. And then Minato, in, what happened to him in the previous episode, he began to stand apart from this very dull, flat line of the group that we've been following. You have a girl who's very timid. We don't know why. We know she has self-shame and sort of self-hate issues. It's about all we know about her. The other girl in the group, other than the fact that she has weird dreams, and she has kind of a weird mindset when it comes to MC's checking her out as opposed to Ranta's checking her out and all that kind of thing. What else do we know about her? With the MC himself, is there anything we know about him? Other than because he is the narrator of most of this, that he is somewhat uncertain. There isn't a sure footing for him. There's not much else we know about him. The most we know about anybody is Ranta. He is a pervert. He is a loose cannon. He, runs off at the mouth. He has actual personality. You can kind of understand what, his character is, what kind of person he is. You can't understand that with any of the other characters. And this has largely been my problem. Even the big burly guy, in seeing his passion for wood carving, for artistry, we are given an insight into his personality through this. And so these are the characters, these are the reasons they're standing out to me little by little. I still don't know some of their names. But whereas in the previous episode, I began to be able to recall from memory Monoto's name because of what, had befallen him, I now know Yume. Because she is the second tentpole for me of this episode of characterization and depth. And even, Haruhiro. I'm finally starting to remember him because now I have a reason to. I found something to connect to with these characters, where finally there is this explosive confrontation between them in answer to the shock and the frustration and the mourning and the just being depressed and uncertain about where to go from here. And that just struck me like a thunderbolt. Like I was feeling the emotions of that scene. I was seeing personality and great character depth in that scene. It was rocking me to my very core. And fleetingly was I still having thoughts of, well, I don't really know them, but it was slipping away because there was personality, there was momentum, there was something happening. It didn't have to be action in the sense of fighting goblins and doing, crazy stunts and doing all this kind of stuff. It was character action, character-driven story, pathos, all these kinds of things. An emotional torrent was unleashed in that moment. They fall into each other's arms, and you could argue there is some level of maybe attraction going on there, because, Yume has been kind of sketchy with the way she feels about those kinds of things. And just Haru all out bawling, it just really affected me. And I was thanking the graces of this series for giving me something. Because everything surrounding that, with the exception, I might add, sort of the side quest, if you will, of trying to, fill the void of a healer priest in the party and being introduced to Mary, I believe her name was, who was a standout character to me for almost the opposite reason that everyone else has not been, along the lines of, we don't get to know her at all. But that's the nature of the character. You see that she's very dispassionate, she's unemotional, she's almost robotic. She is that typical sort of Rei Ayanami-esque character where she's just very plain stated. She's not going to have it any other way than her own. And in that do we derive personality. You can make inferences into what kind of personality she is. And so the contrast, especially making Ranta apologize within the span of a sentence for at first commanding her to not be the way she is and not speak the way she is, but then backpedaling, completely apologizing, losing himself to her persona. In that we see personality. And that's what I'm talking about. It took, 5 episodes for me to start seeing the personality everyone else seems to be fallen over with all of these characters. There has just been a sore lacking of any kind of, characterization for me to grasp onto. Outside of, as I say, big burly guy doing his wood carvings, outside of Ranta's being a pervert loudmouth who's so annoying, but he's the most likable character because he's doing things and saying things. There's momentum. And a lot of that, sort of just melancholy, like the whole series has this underridden melancholy. And I don't like it. It's off-putting to me. That is what is the most off-putting aspect. There's a melancholy and a very droll sort of doling out of dialogue. Most of the dialogue amounts to not very much. Whereas in this episode, as I say, with the big burly guy just unleashing, just releasing of that frustration, it is a little bit comical to see the guys mulling over in the tavern after introducing Mary to the equation, how much they can't stand her, how little she wants to play ball with the party. There are, comical aspects to that. The dude who comes into the bar, who owns the place as soon as he does, I think his name was Renji, who tries to give them like a gold coin or whatever you want to call it, and, MC turns it down, Haruhiro turns it down. That was something happening. That was action. And you were given an insight. You were actually given an insight into the character of Haruhiro in that moment. And I argue that up until now, we haven't seen a whole hell of a lot of that. Like, other than his own self-doubt, what were we given? And a counter-argument I will make against my own point, that we haven't been given a whole hell of a lot, is what we have debuted, the cold reality of the personalities of Haruhiro and Yume respectively, in that they finally voiced they are introverts. With this insight, suddenly I begin to see the lack of characterization in a new light. I'm not as easily forgiving of it, even in spite of this awareness anew. But as a, what I could call a self-proclaimed introvert of my own, I mean, I'm very talkative on camera. But you see me in public, and I don't say a hell of a lot. I'm just not a talkative person. I don't like being around people. It's just my nature. I'm a very quiet, sort of enigmatic personage. And so I could relate to that. I could suddenly understand and see, here are these characters who were put into this crazy situation. They're just going with the flow, and I've been, sort of bothered by the fact that we keep having these hints and whispers of, hey, we came from somewhere else, and what is that? And, are they ever going to address that? But now that I understand these characters are introverted and really have a hard time, probably with social anxiety, something I myself suffer with, I begin to see them and understand them a little better. That is exactly the personality that has been lacking. Tell me that from the get-go. Give me examples, visual examples. Show me this. And I would have a little bit of a better time. You still have the very droll, very tepid, very just slow to get going dialogue. The very passive dialogue. And that, for me, with this underridden melancholy sensation, this rubs me the wrong way. But the series knows how to get things right. I just think it's poorly in its, how it's going about mixing all of those things together. So I can't say I had as much issue with this episode because there were tremendous saving graces in it. Character depth-wise, characterization-wise. As I say, burly dude finally unleashing and just being fed up with this, sort of shock embodied fighting amongst themselves and how that shouldn't be a thing. We shouldn't be doing this. We lost one of our own. We shouldn't now be turning on each other. We should be in support of each other. And this carries off of that momentum, that characterization between Haruhiro and Yume later, when they just collapse into each other because they're at their wits' end. They don't know how to move on without getting some kind of communicative nature across to each other and how they've been feeling and why it's been so frustrating. And those moments, it's like, why, oh why, is the entirety of the series not like this? Why do, it's like they're trying to hold these aspects off so they make a greater impact. They do to a point, but I'm so uninvested in everything else and all of that dullness and all of that dull quality in the dialogue and the utterances of it and the, sort of character interplay, a lot of which has gone nowhere. That, moments like this, while they do draw me in, I'm still not overly affected. I'm not like long-lastingly affected. I'm going to remember the problems I have with the series more than I am its expressive greatest qualities. And to get back to my normal, I understand. It's like watching a car wreck. It's like watching a train wreck, probably, for people who love this series, to hear me going off on it and trying to rip it a new a-hole and everything every week, which is not what I'm trying to do. I have no stake in ripping the show apart. I can only communicate how I'm left feeling after experiencing and watching an episode to episode. And I reiterate, it's never been my plan to cover this episodically. It mystifies me that I keep coming back. But there is always something I find to talk about, to do with it, whether it's the reasons I'm having problems with it, or in the case of the last episode, the resounding aspects that, made that episode great. And this one was, about half as great as the last one. Had really strong characterization moments. But then, to a degree, it was all undone with the final sequence of this episode. Like, you had hooked me in, and then it was like the gross tearing that hook out of my cheek, as if I were a fish, having been fish hooked, with the timid girl, of course, peeking out the window, and from her angle, seeing what could have been taken for fellatio, featuring Haruhiro and Yume, and his realizing what that must look like and being horrified, and it's supposed to be comical, I guess. It's supposed to be lighthearted, it's supposed to be funny, I don't freaking know. It just fell flat. And then subsequently Yume's realizing herself and not being necessarily as bothered. Now that was a little funny because she is really sketchy with this stuff. And then being, berated by Haru for not having a bigger reaction. But I mean, it just killed the mood. It was not mixed well. And it speaks to what I was saying in my last episode discussion video, where the mixtures of focus, how and what they choose to focus on through the course of this series, is mystifying to me. How they have it all mixed together. It's like, again, episodes back, you had, Ranta trying to sneak into the bathhouse, which I'm subsequently told on one of my other videos for this series is going to be, there was a scene cut where you get to see what's going on in the bathhouse, and that's going to be like a Blu-ray DVD extra episode, mini-sode or whatever, I don't know. And it's like, why? Why? Don't make matters worse by actually delving into it. But the immediate episode following, do we have, continuation of this? The guys are made to apologize. Then you had the whole sequence where Haruhiro was really freaking out about guys getting rapey over the girls in their skimpies as they're doing their laundry, and this is never addressed again. And instead, do we have sort of the more counterproductive falling back into that sort of mentality with, oh, timid girl sees them possibly doing stuff, they, like, shocks the hell out of her, and it's like, uh-oh, and it's supposed to be funny. It's played up for humor. It was very tonally jarring from that just thunderstorm, that tumultuous, emotional back and forth between them moments earlier. And so it's an ongoing, enduring thing. Whereas much as I watch this series, there are aspects I am definitely warming to. I'm becoming little by little, more familiar with these characters, remembering them a little bit by name, and I won't argue to the point that, by next episode, if I'm back here, I might have to write the names down because I might have forgotten by then. But at least for the purposes of this episode, the grand emotional moments that were on display in it thoroughly rocked my world. And I just wanted more of that. I crave more of that. Because everything else surrounding it is dull and boring and not mixed well and not there is no tonal equilibrium. And a lot of it, it's jarring and doesn't make sense to me. And a lot of the moments of this series, it just feels like everything is a dead stop. And people are just passively talking, or not. I mean, look at the big music montage we had in, episode 2? Or maybe it was the first episode, I don't even remember anymore. I digress. But that's the thing. It's like there are still lots of problems I'm having with this series. But I'm not going to come on and just deliberately hate on it because I have no stake in that. I can only communicate as best and as knowledgeably as I can how the episodes affect me from episode to episode, how I'm left feeling, whether there is any emotional impact or intellectual, engagement. And for the most part, none. And there has been none in this series. The last couple of episodes thoroughly made leaps and bounds in the other direction, where it really did engage me, it really did pull me in, it really did just, give me goosebumps and get me almost emotional. And made me feel like there was something worthy to be attracted to in the following of these characters. And I am very much sort of enraptured by the idea, as little as we know about him, although now with this insight that he is introverted and, the girls are and everything like that, this sense of Haruhiro's having to step up to the plate and try to mold and morph himself into a leadership role. This should have been an insight earlier than it is now, because there really hasn't been any reason to be endeared to these characters in my estimation. And so you really could have probably dispatched Monoto earlier and made this the focus. It feels like so much of what really matters in the crux of this story could have been done in half the time if they cut out all the gristle and all that dullness. And the journey of seeing, the potential journey of seeing Haruhiro stepping up to that plate is absolutely captivating. I would actually be highly intrigued to see him one by one or as a group try to affect his party and let them have faith in him, burgeon that faith in him within all of them. And to see him being commanding and to see him making, formulated plans and strategizing and really becoming that clarion call to their efforts, to their group. That just sounds mind-bogglingly interesting to me. And I hope it goes that route. I wish they would dial back on all the dead stop, dull sequences that do not amount to a whole hell of a lot. In this episode, it amounted to more because they were in mourning and they were in shock, and that whole introverted nature comes to the fore by the end. But I mean, I haven't been able to enjoy the series, with the exception of the last 2 episodes, in overabundance, because there was no grasping that aspect of their characters. Oh, so that's why we don't know much about them, because they're not sharing much because it's hard for them. If I knew that all along, while I couldn't forgive the dullness qualities, as I say, it would have made it that much more engaging, at least. And of course, to reiterate, to each their own in a bag of chips. I can only voice my own interpretation of everything that's going on in this particular series, even if I do mystify myself that I'm actually as compelled as I am from episode to episode to keep coming back and just wanting to have a discussion about it. But I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below. Love it or hate it. A devout follower of this series, or one who's just sort of hanging on by a wisp, finding it hard to stay interested. Love it or hate it, anything goes. I just love to hear from you guys what you thought of this particular episode, episode 5 of Grimgar, of Fantasy and Ash, and whether you agree with me that there was much more depth in at least a few instances in this episode, and everything else could be a little more well mixed and all that kind of stuff. So otherwise, that'll be pretty much it for me on this. I guess we'll see for the next episode if I'll be back here talking about it again. And go ahead and hit that dislike. I know some of you guys out there really love that stuff. And as long as it amounts to a view, it's all fine for me. So, yeah, it's more about the conversation. And hope this video finds you well. That'll be pretty much it for me on this. And I'll catch you all later. Peace.